Marsha Forchuk. I am Director of Communications for Ukrainian-Jewish Encounter. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming this evening for this event, which is sponsored by our organization and Scholastic Canada. The book that will be presented tonight, and if you all could perhaps turn off your cell phones or put them on pause, it would be much appreciated. The book that's going to be presented tonight by Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch, Don't Tell the Enemy, is an important story. And it is one that deals with the history of Ukraine at a time where there was a lot of upheaval. And it's a story that is not always known, but is important in our understanding of Ukrainian history. It is inspired by the story of Krystia Korpan, who is with us this evening. Пані Христю, можете стати, будь ласка. Her childhood inspired the novel. Don't Tell the Enemy is the story of a Ukrainian girl and her mother who hid 3 Jewish friends under their kitchen floor during the Holocaust in a Ukrainian town. This novel comes against the backdrop of Marsha's hugely popular World War II Making Bongs for Hitler trilogy for young people. Marsha has received many honors for her 20-plus books, including the Ontario Library Association Silver Birch Award twice, the Manitoba Young Readers' Choice Award, the Joffrey Bilson Award for Historical Fiction for Young People, the SCBWI Crystal Kite Award, the Calliope Award for Mentorship and Excellence in Writing from the Humber School for Writers, and was named a Canadian Ukrainian Woman of Distinction by the World Congress of Ukrainian Women's Organizations. In 2008, Marsha was bestowed the Order of Princess Olha by the Ukrainian president in recognition of her children's book, Enough, which was set during the Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine. Her book, Adrift at Sea, about Vietnamese boat people, was included in an exhibit for Pope Francis in Bologna, Italy last year. Marsha's books have been translated into many languages in many countries. And what was interesting for me to find out as I read her biography is that she is dyslexic, a word I can never pronounce, and did not learn to read until she taught herself at the age of 9 by reading Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. She now considers dyslexia her secret weapon because it taught her patience and perseverance, but also helps her see stories from different angles. After completing an honors BA in English and a Master of Library Science degree, backpacking across Europe, which I imagine was fantastic, and working as the first female industrial sales rep in Canada, Marsha focused on writing. After 100 rejections, and it takes tenacity to continue after 100 rejections, her first book was published in 1996, and she's pretty much had a book out year ever since. And you can learn more about her at Calla, CALLA.com. Now, before we give Marsha the floor, I wanted to particularly thank my colleague, Raya Shadursky, who is UJE's Director of Operations. And also I wanted to thank the Trident Banquet Hall, both who have put in so much effort in making this presentation possible. You can learn more about our organization at Ukrainian-Jewish-Encounter.org. We have bookmarks, which please take them. Learn about us, like us, since we have so many young people, on the Facebook page, on our Facebook page. And again, thank you everybody for coming this evening, and I now give Marsha the floor.
So my name is Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch, and I am somewhat Ukrainian, but I don't speak Ukrainian. I was not raised Ukrainian. My grandfather came to Canada in 1912. When he was in Ukraine, he was apprenticed to a Jewish horse trader, and he actually spoke fluent Yiddish. And one thing that my father always told me when I was growing up was that it pained him that there was such conflict between Ukrainians and Jews, and that stuck with me. So that's just a little bit of background context of who I am. And also, I don't just write about Ukrainian stories. As you heard, I've written about Vietnamese boat people. I've written more books about the Armenian genocide than anyone in the English-speaking world. What I write about are stories that no one else has told. And I want to tell you a little story about my childhood. My Ukrainian father and my Irish potato famine, ancestor mother got divorced when I was 9 years old. I still hadn't learned how to read by that time. I was living in a house of conflict. Dad just took off and left. And I don't blame him. I'm not blaming him for this. But this was the 1960s. And what that meant was that my mother and my sister and my mother could not even take money out of the bank because she was female and she was married, and you had to have a check co-signed by your husband to take money out of the bank. So for one whole month, we had no money except for the $10 bill she had in her wallet before Dad left. So that meant that for 1 month, and thank goodness it was the summer, and we lived on what was in the garden, which was mostly eggplant. And this is the 1960s. We went to a Catholic school, and you couldn't say the word divorce in a Catholic community in the 1960s. It was just forbidden. Men would drive past our house at night and throw rotten fruit and vegetables at our house and call my mother names that I won't say out loud. And there I was on the other side with my mom, who is a wonderful person. She's still alive. She has Alzheimer's, so she doesn't even remember who I am anymore. But I listened to all those things that they were saying about her and also about me and my sister, and none of it was true. But the other thing was that they had so much money, they could afford to throw fruit and vegetables at us that we couldn't afford to buy. So what I really wanted to do was to go out and get that and eat it, because I was sick of eggplant. And so that, I thank those men, I do, because what it did was it changed the way that I look at life. And I don't listen to the loud voices, ever. I always listen to the quiet ones. So I listen to the stories that aren't being told. But I also always think of, what's it like for that person to be on that side of the window? And so it was a gift that those men gave me, because they gave me the perception to look at things from the other side of the window. So when I started writing books, if I could find a story that I wanted to read in the library, then I would read it. But what I found was that there are a lot of stories I could not read. Now, I love my dad, and I have a really good relationship with him. And actually, once they were divorced, my mom and dad got along really well. They'd even do stuff with each other's spouses, and they called each other spouse-in-law and all this kind of thing, right? And so, there is no problem that way. But something that I really wanted to know more about was my Ukrainian history, that whole part of my history. Dad didn't know very much about it because he had been born in Canada, and he actually had the Ukrainian beaten out of him because his father had been interned in World War I. And so that's why my name, have you ever heard of any other person who's Ukrainian who has a first name of Marsha? No. Do you know why? My father was Miroslav. But in the prairies, it was an English clerk, and they said Miroslav isn't a real name, so they called him Marshall. And Miroslav means peace on earth, right? Marshall means war. So it kind of changed it. And my Aunt Olga became Alice, because they didn't believe that these were real names. So for my sister and I, my dad didn't want us to go through the same kind of prejudice that he had gone through. So I got his name. He's Marsha Forchuk. I'm Marsha Forchuk Skrypuch. My sister, Cheryl. There's no Ukrainian ever named Cheryl. But, that's why. But so my books, when I write them, it's an exploration for me. I write the books that I want to read. So the way that I was introduced to the story for Don't Tell the Enemy, I was at a book launch, much like this. And I was sitting in the audience, and a beautiful young blonde woman, I'm saying young because like we're about the same age and we're very young, yes. Don't laugh. She came and she sat beside me, and we're listening to the speaker, and she takes this DVD. I'm just sitting there, and then all of a sudden there's this DVD on my lap. And then the speaker finishes and everybody's talking, and she introduces herself and she says, I'm Krystia Korpan. And I says, hello. And she said, I produced this, and this is about my mother. It's about my mother and my grandmother. And I was wondering if you would be interested in writing a book about this. I have to tell you, many people come up to me and say the same thing, but not very many people have produced a documentary about it. But also, there are very few people who have a story like Krystia. Very few people. Because Krystia and her mother hid 3 Jewish friends under their kitchen floor during the Holocaust. Now the thing is that they were Ukrainian, which means that the Nazis were also killing Ukrainians. The stakes were very high in Ukraine. So the Nazis wanted to kill the Jews first, and they were killing the Jews by bullets at that time. But they were also at the same time starving Ukrainians. There was the hunger plan. And so for Krystia and her mother and her sisters to do something as brave as hide their Jewish friends under the kitchen floor, the risk that they decided to take is unimaginable in today's terms. To give you an idea, and I know that many of you know this from your own family history, but not everybody may have heard it from their family, so I'm going to tell you. If you were caught hiding a Jew, the Jew was killed, and so was the person who did the hiding. But it often didn't stop there because there's something called communal responsibility. And what that meant was that in a village or a town, they would take maybe 100 other people who were loosely related to the person who did the hiding and execute all of them too. So this was a hugely brave thing that Krystia, as a 9-year-old, did, and her mother. Imagine that, and her sisters. Absolutely massive. And Krystia is a hero, and I admire her so much. And I'm honestly, like, I can't tell you how much I admire what you've done and what you went through. So I interviewed. I said, yes, like after watching this documentary, I wanted to write this book. And so I contacted Irina, and I don't speak Ukrainian, and Krystia only speaks Ukrainian. And so we did the interview, and we did this with Irina sitting there interviewing, like translating sentence by sentence by sentence. And I think I tormented you guys because I think it was like 6 hours straight, and I know that I didn't pee the whole time. But just talking about everything, and it was just so emotional. And so we got like entire scenes, like in vivid chunks of what I knew was going to go in the book already. And I had initially wanted to write it as nonfiction. Now, I know that like a lot of people think nonfiction means it's true and historical fiction means it's false. And that's not the case. You can have what's called narrative nonfiction, and you can have historical fiction, and there's hardly a difference between them. The difference between the two of them may be that in historical fiction, you name the character something else, or you have composite characters based on a bunch of different people, and then you create the character. But for my books, I'm a unique person in the writing community, in the historical fiction writing community, in that every single historical incident that is in my books, I have at least 2 references. And the reason for that is because I write on topics that the publishers don't know about. So I can't just, I never make anything up. I'm not creative enough to make it up. I look it up. I look it up and I make sure I have 2 references. because a lot of the stuff that happens in my books, people say that can't even be possible. For example, in Making Bombs for Hitler, I was talking to these young people up at the front about it, and there's one incident where children, Ukrainian children who were captured and taken to Germany for slave work, if they were too young to do the slave work, then their blood was drained from them, and that was sent to the front to be used by German soldiers. And the reason that they used the blood of the really young children was because they felt that it wasn't blemished yet, because they hadn't grown into true Ukrainians yet, and Ukrainians were subhuman. So if they were young enough, the blood was good enough to use for their soldiers. But just think of that. And so when that was in that book, my editor like freaked out and said, that can't possibly be true. And I said, well, I have a first-person account. And she said, you need more than that. So I also found reference to that in a dissertation. So I had my 2 references. But, you know, that's what I do. I call myself a librarian detective. I write the stories that have not been told. Now, when Krystia told me her story, there were certain incidents that really stuck out in her head, but it was hard to make them into a complete narrative, because every time there was this incident, I had more questions for myself, and I knew that readers would, than there were answers, partly because Krystia was very young when all this happened. So one of the things was the image that I wanted to start with, and actually the first chapter that I wrote of the book, was when Krystia would sneak to the ghetto and throw food over the barbed wire fence to friends in the ghetto. But then I thought, like, I wrote it, but then writing it, I had so many questions, because first of all, where did she get the food? And so I thought, well, I have to, because there was the hunger plan going on, right? So at the same time that this was happening, they were like trying to get seeds out of old hay. So how could they have food that she could take to the ghetto? Also, how come she wasn't caught? And how come someone her age was doing this and not someone else? So there were too many questions. So dyslexia helped me once again, because then I wrote the chapter before that. And so the chapter before that was a little bit of explanation about things that happened before this. And then I wrote the chapter before that. And so then I got to this chapter where it was another one that I thought would be the beginning. And it was, and I think all of you have seen these photos of when the Nazis came to Ukraine, and people are offering them braided bread and flowers. And someone who sees this without the context would think, well, that must mean that Ukrainians are pro-Nazi. And nothing could be further than the truth. It's just that they thought that no one could be worse than the Soviets. Like, hindsight is 20/20, right? And so then I thought, I can't start there, because people aren't going to understand that at all. So then what I did, I moved it back again, and I started it before the day that the Soviets left. Because what happened when the Soviets left, I mean, I don't have to explain to you, I think everybody here knows that during the first 2 years of the war, Stalin and Hitler were on the same side, right? There was the Stalin-Hitler pact, and there was this massive transfer of populations where Hitler wanted all the Aryans to be moved to the Reich, and Stalin wanted all the Slavs to come so he could send them to Siberia. Like, he didn't want to do anything good with them. But anyway, so there's all this stuff happening, but also, depending on the time, there was someone who was the biggest enemy of the people. And when Operation Barbarossa was about to happen, the current biggest enemy at that time were Ukrainians who were considered the intelligentsia. So anyone in the Ukrainian community who they thought would be the leader. And so these people were still, many of them in prisons, and they were about to be sent to Siberia, but there was no time. So what they did was they killed them all. So the Soviets, as they're leaving, they massacre, but they don't just kill them. They torture them, you know, they do mutilate. And so these bodies are left in these prisons. And then also what happened was they took every bit of food that they could carry. They took every bit of any kind of weapon, and they left the civilians with nothing as the Nazis are approaching. So the way that I started it was the morning, well, during the wee hours of the morning, as the Soviets are leaving, and just before the Nazis come. And Krystia is in bed, and so is her sister and her mother, and they're listening to all this stuff happening. And then someone ends up going into their loft in their shed beside their house, and they don't know what's going on. Now, who it really is it's her cousin, and he's going to end up being caught in this massacre, but I wanted to introduce him then. So that ended up being the beginning of the book. But for me as a writer, you'd think that I would have a better idea of what I'm doing when I start. And I have to tell you, when I get a book contract, they always make me write an outline and the first 3 chapters. And then when I send them the real thing, they say, this has nothing to do with this. And I say, I know, like, but it's good, isn't it? And they like it. And so, and they also just know. And I said, actually, that scene is there. Those chapters are there, but like start at page 87, you'll find them. But you know, they're not 1, 2, and 3. But anyways, so this is what I have done. And I think that it's a really important story too, because the thing is that there have not been many Ukrainians who have told their stories about the relationship that they had with their Jewish neighbors. This has not been something that has been in the public domain at all. And so I was really honored that Krystia would share her story. And also it was so well documented that I just felt that this was a story that really needed to be told. And so I thank you very much for allowing me to do that. Now, something else, I'm not going to keep on talking, but we will open this up if you have questions. But Krystia has agreed to sit with me here during the signing, and she will sign books with me too. Isn't that awesome? Yes. I'm just so pleased. But right now, what I would really like, if you could, is to give Krystia a standing ovation for her heroism. So, any questions? Yes?
Marsha, what happened to the 3 people who were hidden and if they're still alive?
Okay, so you want me to give away the whole book? Is this what you're saying? It's just like, you know, some of these kids up here and other kids have said, so at the end of Making Bombs for Hitler, does she ever get back together with her sister? Yes.
This is pretty heavy material. What age group would you say it's appropriate for?
Age 10 and up. They put on the book 12 to 14, but you know, like Making Bombs for Hitler, I actually get pencil-written mail, snail mail from kids as young as 9. Some in grade 3, if you can believe it.
You know,
And
my daughter's teacher bought her that book.
Yes.
And she was 9 at the time.
Yes. And the thing that is hard for adults to understand sometimes is that this is a paraphrase of a quote by Philip Pullman, who is a famous children's writer in the UK. And he said that there's some subjects, some topics that are so serious and profound that they can only be dealt with in children's literature. And so what I take from that is that when you're writing for adults, the prime purpose is entertainment, but for children, the prime purpose is to know how to live their life. And so, you know, you can deal with universal truths in children's literature, unlike for adults. The other thing too is that if I wrote the same book for adults, then it would have not been from Krystia's perspective, it would have been from someone else's perspective. And Krystia is really the most important person because of the things that she decided to do at her age. So that makes a difference too. And young people can read and understand things on a much more profound level than most adults can give them credit for, but also things that adults can read and upset them for other reasons don't upset kids. Because especially the people who have the toughest time with my books are people who lived through World War II and the Holocaust. And so people who have lived through that sometimes can read 1 page at a time and then they have to put it down and they say, I love it, but I can't take any more than that. but kids tend not to have that kind of experience. And so they're able to take it and they learn, and also by reading something horrible, they're able to actually have the same kind of brain chemistry of maturing that you would have by living through it, but not having to live through it. Questions? Yes?
Why is it called Don't Tell the Enemy?
Well, because Krystia is doing things behind the Nazis' back. So if someone told what she was doing, she'd be in pretty big trouble. So my husband wanted it to be called Don't Tell the Commandant. So if you think that Don't Tell the Commandant is a better title, put up your hand. If you think Don't Tell the Enemy is a better title, put up your hand. Oh, he's going to be so upset. Any other questions? Yes? I haven't, but I know Kathy. She's a good friend of mine. Yeah. Authors stick together. Did you know that we have an author here? We have Shelley Becker. Shelley, can you stand up? Shelley writes picture books, and stunning picture books, and actually her newest one is, well, it's not your newest.
Right, I have one coming out in October, that's the newest.
But the
current one is called Even Superheroes Have Bad Days.
and it's a Blue Spruce nomination.
And the next one is a sequel, Even Superheroes Make Mistakes.
Yeah. How cool is that?
Thanks, Marsha.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to be here with Krystia. And Irina, do you have something that you'd like to say?
This is Maya, my granddaughter. First of all, I just want to express my gratitude to Marsha, excellent writer, talented, and I'm so glad that you picked up the story and put it in the book. That means the story of my family is still alive. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Maya, I want you to present the flowers to Marsha.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And thank you, of course, to Ukrainian-Jewish and Banquet
Yes.
for organizing this event.
Thank you so
very
much.